What is the hardest cup in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe? Seems like a pretty simple question, right? In fact, if I were to ask you to have a quick think about what you'd consider the toughest cup, I'm sure most of you would have at least one in mind. Now, out of the 12 main cups that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe offers, there are definitely a few that many consider tougher than the rest. I'm sure the Special Cup in particular popped into a lot of our minds. I mean, how could it not when considering its track lineup? But it got me thinking, is it really that simple? Or are there certain cups that prove to be dark horses and are more challenging than first thought? And with that thought in mind, I took it upon myself to figure out which of these cups truly was the hardest. But how exactly did I do that, you ask? Well, I simply raced through each of them and then compared the points I received. Mario Kart definitely has a luck factor though, so what's to say that a worse score wasn't due to bad luck or even an off day? Now these would certainly be detrimental factors if I was simply racing through each of these cups just once. But to get a better average, I wanted to give each cup a good shot, which resulted in me losing my sanity while racing through each of these cups not just twice, not 5 times, not even 10 or 20, but 50 times each. These were completed in 2 sets of 25, which if we assume each cup takes about 10 minutes to complete, was about 4 hours straight each session, racing the exact same course, over and over. And while I initially thought this was a good idea, I soon realized that so done with this game. Yeah, okay, maybe it wasn't the best idea. But alas, we stuck through it all in the name of science. Now just a few more things, all of these races were completed as Mario in the standard kart with normal wheels and the super glider on 200cc and with smart steering turned off. This video also won't include the booster pass tracks, but I may do an iteration of this video for them once they do all finally release. Now with all of that out of the way, all that remains is figuring out what exactly is the hardest cup in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Now starting us off is the Mushroom Cup. Now coming into this experiment, I thought for sure this would be the easiest. It's the very first cup and the tracks it offers reflect that. The first of these is your standard Mario Stadium course. There's honestly not much to say about this one. Because it's the very first track, the roads are straight, the turns are wide, and it makes it extremely easy to stay on the track, even at 200cc and with 4 hours sleep. The only time you're not coming in first on this course is probably due to some cheese tactics. Now moving on to Water Park. This is certainly a small step up from Mario Stadium, but all in all, it's not too bad. The hardest part is probably the somewhat tight turns underwater, but apart from that, there's no way to fall off the track, and the rest is pretty much smooth sailing. It does get a few points due to the hardest section technically being at the end of the track, and after a few hours of playing, let's just say you can definitely slip up. Now moving into the latter half of this cup, we've got Sweet Sweet Canyon. Now honestly, this one is a hit or miss, definitely not the toughest track, but there are certain areas that could prove challenging if you're not fully paying attention. Mainly the section that splits off into 2, and I definitely found myself flying off the course during later runs. Overall though, it's not that complex. And the cup finishes off with Thwomp Ruins, which is probably the hardest track in this cup. Not only does it have a few tight turns, but there are, as you'd expect, plenty of thwomps looking to end your career. Wow, really? Okay, it's fine. What? All in all, the Mushroom Cup has a rather tame lineup of tracks, and given that it's most likely the first cup that many players come into contact with, this makes sense. After 50 runs, I ended with an average of 55.25 points out of 60, and as I mentioned, Thwomp Ruins proved to be the most difficult with an average placement of 1.67. Now moving straight over onto the other easy cup, we have the Shell Cup. Now I say easy, but this one did actually surprise me. The Shell Cup starts off with Moo Moo Meadows, a very basic course. The turns are wide, there's no way to fall off it, and apart from the winding road with the holes and cows on it, there's not much here that could really throw you off. Mario Circuit, on the other hand, while appearing simple, did actually give me some trouble, especially on 200cc where braking is crucial. Now after mind-numbingly racing this cup for hours and hours, I did end up taking this turn too wide, not braking and ending up in the tyre barriers. And if you don't want to take my word for it, I mean even the CPUs were struggling here. Cheep Cheep Beach was on the easier end. There's a lot of straight roads, and while there are both underwater and land areas, 200cc is so fast that it doesn't really matter where you drive through. Overall, a simple track as long as you remember that little mud splat on the last turn. Safe to say, my dumbass forgot about it numerous times, which did actually cost me a few placements. Now onto the dark horse of this cup, Toad's Turnpike. This track is a torture chamber compared to the rest of the tracks we've covered so far, especially on 200cc. While the layout of the track may look simple enough, the roads are packed with trucks and cars. Now avoiding these cars and stuff is hard enough, but I found myself gliding out of bounds numerous times. And other times as well, I mean anything can happen on this course. At the end of it all, I averaged 54.14 points, meaning it was technically harder than the Mushroom Cup. Toad's Turnpike as well was by far the toughest track in this cup. Coming into the Flower Cup, we have another... Jesus, just how many Mario circuits or stadiums are there? Honestly though, this may be the easiest of them all. It may look trippy with all the anti-gravity section, but its layout leaves much to be desired. Toad's Harbour is in a similar boat. Half the course is made up of straight roads. The hardest part is probably at the very start, in the market area. So even if you do somehow suck ass and fall into the water, there's plenty of time in the rest of the track to catch up. Now zooming into Twisted Mansion, this is probably the first track to truly require some excessive braking on turns. As you can see in these clips, it took me far too long to figure that out. The glider section into that turn is brutal, and I even ended up out of bounds somehow. I swear I'm cursed in some way. I mean, what the f is this? The zigzag underwater can also get pretty tight if you're going at light speeds, overall making for a decently stacked and difficult track. Now what's becoming seemingly obvious, Nintendo loves saving the toughest tracks for last, and Shy Guy Falls keeps this trend live. There are plenty of rough turns to take, and you can bet your sweet ass, if you're going too fast, you'll find yourself falling off down to hell. Let me say, sleep deprivation and this track don't go well together. Now after zooming through the Flower Cup 50 times, I ended up averaging 53.65 points, with Shy Guy Falls taking the spot as the hardest track. The Banana Cup was up next, and it's the perfect example of a cup that's carried by one track essentially. And that track was certainly not Dry Desert. This track's roads are very wide and there's not much to it really. The winding road with the pokies probably offers the most challenge, but if you're slick with it, you could effortlessly glide under them. Am I really gonna upload this video? It's embarrassing. Yeah, I'm still working on getting that down though. Now despite Donut Plains 3 being, well, extremely plain, on 200cc you'll find yourself off course a lot unless you're braking properly. I've seen my friends struggle a lot on this course, but honestly, once you get the braking down around some of the tighter turns, it's honestly not too bad. Now Donut Plains isn't the only plain track in this cup. Royal Raceway also struggles to be that memorable. I'm not sure if this is a hot take, but I think it has slightly tighter turns than Donut Plains, especially the one coming out of the glider section and that stupid balloon. Even so, I never had too much trouble with this track. I wish I could say the same for the next one though. DK Jungle, fittingly left to last as the final boss of this cup. This track has it all. Tight turns, plenty of areas to fall off on, close quarters to get railed by items, and a sketchy section at the end that can easily screw all your placements up. It certainly added some much needed difficulty to what was a relatively easy cup. All in all, I ended the Banana Cup with a 53.1 point average, with DK Jungle outmatching the rest of the tracks by far. Let's move on to the Star Cup. Now if we're talking about which cups had the best soundtracks, this one would definitely be up there. The Star Cup starts off with Sunshine Airport, a relatively standard track with plenty of glider sections. Apart from a few turns that threw me off the more tired I got, this track is pretty simple, which is typical for the first track of a cup. Moving onto a banger course with an even better soundtrack, we've got Dolphin Shoals. This track is one of the best in my opinion, and while it doesn't offer too much challenge overall, you can certainly find yourself doing stupid things while trying to be too cute with it, or maybe that was just me. Electrodome was up next, and despite it having a lot of winding roads that you'd expect would add some challenge, they're not that tight, and a lot of the time, you'll be racing on long wide roads with plenty of space to drift. Definitely one of the easier tracks in this cup. The Star Cup finishes off with Mount Warrior, where all laps are essentially completed in one round. Now, Mount Warrior is pretty interesting. The start can be dangerous due to there being no railing, but the most difficult section has to be the middle area, especially towards the end where you enter that little forest area, where you're looking to dodge through the infinite number of trees. The track's final section is fairly simple, and rounds out what was an average track in terms of difficulty. I averaged 54.04 points when racing through the Star Cup, with Mount Warrior proving to be the most challenging. We're now halfway through this challenge. I was certainly getting tired of playing Mario Kart every day for hours, but I know this question of which cup is the hardest is up there as one of the most important in the whole world, so I powered through. Now, the Leaf Cup opens up with Wario Stadium, and while it has some tight turns, the worst part of this track is that little Z section. That area f***ed me up multiple times without realizing I would be flying off course trying to drift around it. The rest of the course has its own tricky turns, but I can't remember anything over that stupid Z area. Even so, that's still more than I remembered from Sherbert Land as a whole. This track is just boring, there's not much to it. It may have a lot of turns, but most of them can drift around without the need for braking. I did get confused towards the later hours because it's all ice and I'm dumb, so I got lost at certain points. But overall, this track was easy enough. Now I'm not going to lie, I struggled a lot with Melody Motorway, at least a lot more than I initially expected. The track starts off simple enough, but there's this one turn that I just kept flying off. I thought it was barriered off at first, and I guess I never learned it wasn't because time after time I flew off straight from first place into last place. Oh, and those notes that jump up and down were annoying as fuck. I got squished far too many times than I'm willing to admit. Ending us off is Yoshi's Valley, known for its winding roads and alternative routes. In saying that, I guess you could say the difficulty of this track varies depending on the route you take. Well, it would if any of these routes were actually difficult. For the most part, this is a standard track, and while it's cool seeing that massive egg roll around, it almost never causes any damage. I put up a relatively weak average of 53.37 at the end of the League Cup. No thanks to Melody Motorway, which was my Achilles heel. We've arrived at the cup that I'm sure most of us predicted would turn out to be the hardest, but does it truly live up to its infamous reputation? The special cup wastes no time, throwing us straight into the deep end with Cloudtop Cruise. For the first track in the cup, Cloudtop Cruise is fairly challenging. Its saving grace is a lot of the cloud sections are actually guarded by railing, which certainly helps stop what would be plenty of screw-ups, on my part at least. It's certainly the hardest first track so far, but even Cloudtop Cruise's difficulty pales in comparison to the rest of this cup. Bone Dry Ruins one-ups Cloudtop Cruise, at least it did for me. The layout of the track itself can be confusing when starting off, and some of the turns are brutal, especially coming out of boost sections. This cup certainly wasn't scoring around, and unfortunately the same can't be said about me 3 hours into this challenge. Oh god, I'm trash at this shit. Someone just kill me. Now Bowser's Castle is an infamous track. It's always there alongside Rainbow Road and usually garners a reputation for being rather difficult, but honestly I found this track to be the easiest over the 50 races. This course layout itself is simple, but it's got a lot of distractions. Flaming wheels, spiked balls, massive boulders, and while the Bowser smashing on the track looks intimidating, he's pretty much cosmetic. He doesn't really do anything. Wait. Oh my god. Well, most of the time he's cosmetic. Now let's move on to the final boss, this game's iteration of Rainbow Road. The question is, does it live up to the expectations that come with that very name? Nope. Oh, no, whoops. Wow. Ah, jeez. Yeah, so as you'd expect, this track was a nightmare on 200cc. No railing, tight turns that demand braking, and a soul-crushing final turn that lost me far too many races. I'm going to stop talking about this track as it's bringing up some serious PTSD. To no one's surprise though, I ended this special cup with an average of 50.75 points. Pathetic, I know. With Rainbow Road taking the spot for the hardest track by a mile, which is honestly saying something considering the overall difficulty of the cup. Now up next was the Lightning Cup, which wasn't as tough as I initially expected when looking at the track lineup. The first track is Tick-Tock Clock, which I didn't have a great start on. I got Mario Karted super hard. Yep, alright, whatever. Oh, f*** off, seriously. It's my first— Don't you dare hit me, Star. Thanks. But what about the actual track itself? You know, it's fairly simple. I think it has one hard turn that you need to brake for, but apart from that, it's pretty straightforward. Moving on, we come to Piranha Plant Pipeway, which I personally remember giving me a lot of trouble back in the day. Inside the pipes itself is actually quite narrow, and the turns towards the middle section definitely require some braking in order to not fall off. Once it opens out into the underwater section though, it's kind of smooth sailing until the end. Now Grumble Volcano is one of those courses that changes with each lap. In saying this, the course starts off fairly easy and gets harder as the laps go on, with more of the track sinking into the lava below. You certainly have to keep an eye out and pay attention as the track shifts, which, I mean, as you can tell from the gameplay, I'm struggling to do. This was actually the lowest placement I got by a long shot out of this whole entire experiment. Once again, we've come to a Rainbow Road. Back-to-back cups now with Rainbow Roads. But while the Special Cups Rainbow Road was a nightmare, this iteration of the N64's Rainbow Road seems like heaven. There's literally no tight turns, and even if you did find yourself taking a turn too late, most of it is blocked by railing, meaning you most likely won't ever fall off it. In fact, Rainbow Road was the track I averaged the highest placement out of all the tracks in the Lightning Cup, which is, I mean, it's something. I went on to average 53.76 points, with Grumble Volcano taking the toughest spot in this cup with an average placement of 2.27. The Egg Cup was taken on next, and offered a nice variety of easy to hard tracks in my opinion. Now Yoshi Circuit is an iconic track, and while I love the layout, I mean who doesn't, it's Yoshi, or Yoshi. Yeah, people get triggered when I say it the wrong way. I hardly ever race on this track, so I was awful when starting off. It's got plenty of tight turns, and its little spiky spine area in particular with the piranha plants can be difficult to get down. Obviously over time I got more comfortable, and by the end of it, this track didn't pose too much trouble. And speaking of tracks that don't pose any trouble, we have Excitebike Arena. I mean, there's really not much to say about it, it's just baby park but with a ton of ramps. Even if you were to just drive around this without even drifting, you'd still place extremely well. There's really not much else to say about it. Now we go from one of the easiest tracks to one of the hardest with Dragon Driftway. Now Dragon Driftway loves its windy roads and swirling turns. I'm telling you, at 200cc, if you're trying to go around these at top speed without braking, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. I can't count the number of times I wasn't thinking straight and ended up smashing straight into the wall, killing all momentum I had, as well as a lot of the runs I had. Rounding off the Egg Cup is Mute City, modelled after Mario Kart's racing brother, F-Zero. Now if you've ever played an F-Zero game, you'd know that it makes 200cc feel like slug speeds. But in hopes of trying to replicate that speed, Mute City is covered in speed boost panels. And while these could prove to be challenging, they're used mainly on the straighter roads that have wider turns. There's maybe one tight turn towards the end, but apart from that, it's a fairly tame track to end off the cup. All in all, I ended the Egg Cup with a 53.94 average, with Dragon Driftway taking the spot as the most difficult track. Now the Triforce Cup was one of the few that I thought could actually give the Special Cup a run for its money. It starts off with Wario's Gold Mine, which I know can be quite challenging, especially on 200cc with its unguarded turns, but after a few races on it, you start to realize that after the starting area, there's nothing really that can derail you. I mean, even the mine carts are there to help you instead of stop you. Now, if 2 Rainbow Roads weren't enough, how about a third one? Question is, where does this one rank in terms of difficulty? If we were to go back in time and started using SNES hardware, I'd most likely say this was the hardest, but in the current day, I'd probably say it sits somewhere in the middle. It's definitely not as complex and technical as Mario Kart 8's version, but compared to the N64 Rainbow Road, it's actually quite a challenge. There's no railings, so you have to take your turns extremely carefully, all while avoiding those annoying thwomps again. Now Ice Outpost, I'm not going to lie, it's one of the more forgettable tracks in my opinion, which also means I had no idea what to expect when first going into it. And I have to say, even after racing it 50 times, I still think it's one of the more forgettable tracks. It plays off having 2 intertwining tracks throughout the course, but unfortunately this doesn't really add that much challenge. Now I say this, yet I still somehow ended up off the track at times. What can I say? Fatigue makes me even worse than I already am. We've moved on from one of the more forgettable courses to one of the most memorable ones. And if you think I'm biased, well, just look at my channel name. Now, Hyrule Circuit starts off like any other track, with some winding turns, and doesn't necessarily get harder until you enter the room with the Master Sword. If the middle ramp doesn't open up, the turns on the side can actually be quite sharp. I do like that on 200cc, after boosting out of the main room, you can skid over the grass area due to the high speeds, but overall it's a decent track that offers an alright challenge. The Triforce Cup in general did offer a fairly decent challenge. It didn't quite put up the same challenge as the Special Cup, with me averaging 52.22 points, with Rainbow Road once again taking the spot as the most difficult track. Now the Crossing Cup actually surprised me, especially considering it opens with the easiest track of them all. And if you don't believe Baby Park is the easiest track, then no, I'm sorry, there's just no arguing it. The track may be hectic and can be a lot of fun with tons of people, but it's certainly not hard. Now Cheese Land does have some difficult moments, mainly that chain chomp jump. This guy just doesn't leave me alone, and if he does, I can never get the turn right after it. And if both of those things don't happen, then I'm most likely getting mid jump. So what the is it with this jump, man? Why can't I? What's going on? That one jump is just, I hate it so much. The rest of the course thankfully doesn't add too much difficulty. The other turns with the chomp can be awkward at times, but apart from that, it's not necessarily that bad. Wild Woods. Oh, Wild Woods. I hate this goddamn track. It's nothing to do with the layout, it's more so the fact that I just suck ass, and every time I went over that glider section, I'd ram straight into the wall and then struggle down the water slide. Doesn't help that this section is right before the end, so I tanked a ton of placements as a result. The less said about this track, the better. Now moving on to the track that gave this cup its name, we have Animal Crossing. Now this one's kind of cool, it has multiple variations depending on the season, and while the layout may not change, the distractions blocking your path do. Now I wouldn't say any particular season is more difficult than the next though. The track itself is pretty chill, with a lot of it being made up of straight roads and wide turns. Definitely one of the easier tracks in this cup. Now I didn't know what to expect going to this cup, but thanks to Wild Woods fucking me up, this one actually turned out to be middle of the pack in terms of difficulty. Now this was the dark horse cup of this whole entire experiment, the Bell Cup. It may not seem as intimidating as the Special Cup, but its courses certainly aren't lightweights. If anything, the first track, near Bowser City, throws you straight into the deep end from the get-go. This track has some absolutely brutal turns. You all know the ones I'm talking about. Even with maximum braking, I would end up charging a mini turbo just to boost myself straight off the edge. As someone who's used to racing 150cc with friends, I was getting absolutely bodied by these turns, and the results weren't pretty, I'm telling you. The Bell Cup would keep the stakes high going into Ribbon Road. This track has multiple ribbons, but the one that makes this track somewhat difficult is most definitely the blue one. It kind of flaps up and down, meaning it kind of tricks you into mini jumping off and tricking off it. But at the same time, the turns afterwards are quite sharp, and if you're not careful and you're not braking properly, you'll find yourself flying straight off this ribbon. The jump after the booster ramp especially can catch you off guard, especially when you're speeding along at 200cc. Overall though, this is one of the more middle of the pack tracks in this car. Our next stop is at the Super Bell Subway. Now the majority of this track was actually smooth sailing, but this is another one of those ones that tries to f you right at the end. The actual subway area with the trains isn't too much of a hassle, but coming up the stairs into the underground moor area just before the finish line is brutal, especially because they put a booster pad just before it. So if you're not ready to brake, you're going to end up in one of the cafes or shops. Certainly did cost me a few placement spots, considering it's just before the finish line. Now this cup ends with another visit to the kart racer's beloved brother series with Big Blue. Like Mount Wario, this is one big track, and just like Mute City, this one's loaded with speed boosting devices. And if you thought taking sharp turns at 200cc was hard enough, imagine doing that while going even faster. Now despite me saying this, I actually didn't have too much trouble with this track in the long run. And while it may not respect the source material of going extremely fast, braking is essential if you want to complete this course without flying all over the place. At the end of it all, the Bell Cup put up quite a fight, giving me an average of 50.98 points, with Neo Bowser City proving to be one of the most challenging tracks, not just in this cup, but also in the entire game. So there you have it. All that's left is to see where each cup ranks in terms of difficulty. The easiest cup was the Mushroom Cup, as I'm sure many of us expected. This was followed by the Shell Cup, the Star Cup, the Egg Cup, the Lightning Cup, and the Flower Cup. Moving into the top half, we have the Crossing Cup, the Leaf Cup, and the Banana Cup. Now all three of these were essentially carried by one track that was significantly harder than the rest, meaning that it dropped the average just enough to stay out of the easier half of cups. The top 3 cups though definitely had the hardest tracks, but they were more balanced, including multiple tough tracks rather than just one super hard one. Now coming in at 3rd place we have the Triforce Cup, and 2nd was the Bell Cup, and as I'm sure most of you predicted, we have the Special Cup coming in as the hardest cup from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Honestly though, the Bell Cup put up an extremely good fight, especially for a cup without a Rainbow Road. As a little bonus fact, these are the top 5 hardest tracks according to my average placements. I expected Rainbow Road to be at the top, so I was actually pleasantly surprised to see Neo Bowser City take the top slot. For anyone that cares, these are what I found to be the top 5 easiest tracks as well. Obviously it's a lot of the starter tracks, with Baby Park and Baby Park V2 taking the top spot. I've left the Excel spreadsheet down below in the description if anyone else wants to try this stupid experiment, or if you want to see the placements of all the races for each cup and track that I race. Also just want to say that this isn't definitive. Obviously what I found here isn't going to be the same for everyone, but it was something that I found interesting and wanted to test. If you guys enjoyed this video, please do drop a like and consider subscribing. This video in particular was about a month in the making, so I appreciate any support from you guys. I hope to see you all in the next one.